DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis, and Heidi Peroni from Washington State Department of Agriculture Organic Program, Jacob Guth and Anna Rivas from CCOF Certification Services and Food Safety Program. And so we're going to get to the webinar presentation shortly, but first a few quick housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we're going to turn off the videos during the presentation, and I'm actually going to keep my video off the whole time, but the rest of the folks will be on. We just wanted to let you know that there are faces behind the voices, and that we're not just kind of echoes on the internet. So my name is Megan Donovan, and I will be your host today. Behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance, and she'll be the one fielding the questions that may come in when technical issues arise or you just have content questions. The CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a food safety outreach program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA, and also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. This is the 6th webinar in our 9-part Food Safety for Organic Processor series. We've added this series on produce safety for growers to our lineup because we heard from participants of past webinars that they would like a review of the FSMA produce safety rule in addition to the webinars we've hosted on the FSMA preventative controls rule. So we're going to kind of take a little detour and get into the weeds on produce safety for the next 2 webinars. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator, and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And next, a quick Zoom tutorial. I know most folks are probably super comfortable with Zoom, but I'm still learning a couple of things here and there. So to see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen to exit to full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions or comments into the field at the bottom of the box and click Send. If you would like to send your questions anonymously, click on the Send Anonymously box on the left. And note, we will not be using the chat function for this webinar, so send all your messages via the question and answer box. Feel free to send questions during any point of the webinar. We will collect them and answer them at our question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. So I also wanted to highlight the intended audience for today's webinar. As noted in the title, this webinar is geared towards small organic farms that may fall in the exempt or qualified exempt compliance categories of the produce safety rule. And if you're wondering what in the world does that mean, that doesn't make sense, you're in the right place. We're going to go over that in about 5 minutes. But I also just wanted to say, if there are folks in the audience from larger operations that need to fully comply with the produce safety rule, that this series still provides a nice overview. And we're also, we'll include a slide at the end of the presentation with some resource links specifically for operations that need to fully comply. And I just wanted to note that because there's some places in the webinar we're going to reference some tips or recommendations specifically geared towards small exempt farms. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. And finally, I also wanted to just kind of give a note to the organic growers in the audience that there is some overlap between the FSMA produce safety rule and the National Organic Program. One of the big things is being organic growers is you keep records and you're sort of used to record keeping, so that can give you a leg up. If you're new to FSMA and just kind of, getting into those waters, there are some areas in the produce safety rule that are not covered in the NOP. For example, the produce safety rule has a whole section on worker health and hygiene that's not touched in the NOP. So I just kind of wanted to let you know that. And also, if you really want to get into the weeds, there's a really good resource put out by the Community Alliance of Family Farmers that has kind of a comparison chart between food safety and organic regulations. And the link's there and is also in the resource section. And also, in addition to that, we just wanted to clarify that FSMA does not require that you do anything that would contradict the National Organic Standards Program. And we'll get into that a little later in the presentation too. But I know particularly when first FSMA came out, there was some concerns from organic growers that there might be required to do things that would be against the National Organic Program standards, and that is not the case. So with that, I would like to introduce our lead trainer. Dr. Stephanie Smith is a statewide consumer food safety specialist in the School of Food Science at Washington State University. She delivers food safety and regulatory training for growers, food processors, food handlers, and consumers across Washington State. Joining Stephanie today, we have Dr. Erin DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis, as well as Heidi Peroni from Washington State Department of Agriculture Organic Program, Jacob Duguthin and from the CCOF Certification Services Food Safety Program. So thank you everyone for being here, and Stephanie, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. I want to thank you all for joining us today. As Megan said, we'll be reviewing some of the fundamentals of the produce safety rule under FSMA. And we've divided this up into two parts. So part one will cover part of the rule today, and then we will finish up covering the rest of the rule next week. So as an overview for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the need for improved food safety in the fresh produce market, and then give you an overview of the produce safety rule, including exemptions. And there are some requirements that you have to meet regardless of your exemption status. So that'll be good to know. Some specific topics within the rule, the ones we're going to cover specifically today are going to include soil amendments, worker health and hygiene, and then wildlife and domestic animals and land use. So we're going to get started today by doing a poll. So the poll is, what crops do you produce? And if you just want to answer that question, that should have popped up on your screen. So you're getting a lot of different responses back. Okay, so it looks like we have a pretty good mix of participants growing different types of crops. So root vegetables and other vegetables, as well as tree fruit and leafy greens are all pretty popular. Some people are growing sprouts, and then we have some berry and growers and nuts. So that's great. It's wonderful that we have a good mix of people that are joining this webinar. I will make one note on the sprouts that there are some separate regulations for sprouts that we won't specifically be covering here. There are other training programs that focus on sprouts. So if you are a sprouts grower, I recommend that you reach out to find some additional training on the sprouts regulations if you haven't already. Okay, so before we get started, disclaimer that this is not an official produce safety rule training. If you are interested in taking an official produce safety training, then please visit the Produce Safety Alliance Growers training website, and they'll have a list of upcoming courses. I know that they occur all the time in both California and Washington. So you can also reach out to your extension office and see if they're offering any, or if they're aware of ones are being offered in your area. So this basically is Megan already stated, this webinar is to provide an overview of the produce safety rule. So we'll talk about coverage and exclusions, and then some of the topic requirements, and then steps for getting started. So if you're not already covered, you're exempted from the rule for whatever, for any other reasons that you could be exempted or excluded, then at least it'll give you an overview of what the rule states, and then some steps you can do to start being in compliance with the rule if you're not already. So we will get started now and talk about the need for improved food safety. So, a lot of people have the idea that, foodborne illness is something where, you get a 24-hour stomach bug and it self-resolves, but it's really a huge problem because each year an estimated 48 million Americans get sick as a result of a foodborne pathogen. There's a lot of bacteria and viruses and parasites that can cause these foodborne illnesses. And a 2015 study showed out of Ohio State University showed that the estimate cost of medical treatment, lost productivity, and illness-related mortality of $55.5 billion due to foodborne illnesses. More recent estimates have come out closer to about $156 billion per year. And just keep in mind that this does not necessarily include things like recalls or, costs to businesses, attorney's fees, those sorts of things. So this is basically for just medical treatment, lost productivity, and illnesses. So many of the foodborne illness outbreaks have been caused by fresh produce. So in the US from 96 to 2010, 23% of all outbreaks were caused by produce, and 16 of 68 multi-state foodborne illness outbreaks from 2006 to 2014 were associated with vegetables. And so primarily in the produce safety rule, there's a large focus on bacteria because they cause the most outbreaks, illnesses, and deaths. But there is also concern for viruses and parasites contaminating produce as well. So once produce becomes contaminated, unless it's going to be further processed for a kill, like a heat treatment step, a kill step to kill pathogens, then it's really hard to be able to remove pathogens from produce once they're on the produce. This just gives you an idea of some of the plant-associated outbreaks that have been recorded in the United States. So vegetable row crops have been responsible for 24% of the plant-associated outbreaks, and also 24% were caused by fruit. 16% by grains and beans, and 13% by seeded vegetables. But when you look at this, you really see that there's a lot of different plant associated, outbreaks, that nothing has been exempt from, you know, causing an outbreak, right, in the United States. This is just a list of some of the selected produce linked outbreaks and the cause of the foodborne illness. So there's been several for romaine lettuce, and you know, this hasn't been updated, but definitely 2018 and 2019 were big years, unfortunate years for romaine lettuce. There was an outbreak on leafy greens, or contributed to leafy greens contaminated with E. coli in 2017. Cucumbers, there's been some recurring issues with cucumbers, 2013 through 2015. You know, cilantro, mangoes. I think most of us are aware of the cantaloupe, the outbreaks that were caused by contaminated cantaloupes, especially the listeria outbreak in 2011. So I think that, you know, the take home message of this is that, you know, a lot of different produce is involved in outbreaks. Some of them, there have been recurring outbreaks. And then consumption of fresh produce is actually still a major cause of E. coli 0157H7 infections. A lot of people, you know, think E. coli and think of ground beef, right? But fresh produce is also still a major cause of E. coli outbreaks. Okay, foodborne illness can cause long-term health effects, and that's something I always try to really stress to people, that it's not just the stomach flu. So it can cause things like kidney injury, chronic arthritis, neurological symptoms, and then of course lifelong gastrointestinal issues, and then even potentially cause death. So, you know, a lot of times the foodborne illnesses are self-resolving within a short period of time, but they can also cause really severe illnesses and even death. So we want to keep that produce from becoming contaminated with pathogens that cause these diseases. The other thing to be aware of is that, of course, pathogen contamination creates a lot of, or contamination of produce with pathogens creates a lot of loss. So, you know, you have loss of people's health or life, consumer confidence is affected, right? Because, for example, if there's a romaine lettuce, you know, recall because it's contaminated with E. coli, and that basically can wipe out the entire romaine lettuce market for that season, right? Whether your product is involved or not, you know, it can have a negative effect on you. And then, you know, of course, there's money that's lost from initiating a recall and from reduced sales. And then, you know, there's been a lot of money put into growing the food and harvesting it, and, you know, a lot of worker training and wages. And so all that's a huge expense that then ends up in food that's never sold. And then potentially it can also result in a loss of business, especially if it causes a foodborne illness outbreak and there are and you know, you were to get sued potentially by somebody who got sick from a product. So because of that, we really want to try to keep produce safe as possible. And so we're gonna start talking about some of the produce safety rules here. So the produce safety rule is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was signed into law in 2011. The Food Safety Modernization Act, known as FSMA, is composed of 7 rules. And so, of course, we're going to be focusing on produce safety, but this does cover everything from growing, harvesting, packing, holding of produce to food processing, foreign supplier verification, transportation. You know, there's a whole list of everything. So the goal is to prevent food safety hazards across the entire food system. So more about the produce safety rule. This is the first mandatory federal standard for covering growing, packing, harvesting, and holding of produce. And we always tell people there will be inspections by a regulatory agency. So in Washington State Department of Agriculture is doing inspections for farms. where I'm located, and they will be looking at documentation that's required under the law and, doing inspections, looking at your practices and making sure you're in compliance with the law. So with regard to compliance, basically under the rule, there's different compliance dates based on your business sizes. And we'll talk a little bit more about exemptions in just a minute. But basically, businesses with sales over 500,000 is adjusted. It's adjusted yearly, and that's based on a 3-year average of sales. They had to comply with the rules starting in January of 2018. Small businesses with sales between 250,000 to 500,000, adjusted for inflation, had to comply in 2019. And then very small businesses with sales of 25,000 to 250,000 had to comply in 2020. Now, as you note, there's some water compliance dates, and we'll talk more about this in part 2 of the webinar series. But the water compliance dates for complying with the water regulations under this rule began for the larger businesses in January of this year. But there's been some, FDA's taking enforcement discretion on that right now, and we'll talk about that in part 2. So please join us for that. So let's get into some of the exemptions and exclusions. So produce, the first exemption is if you are growing produce that's considered rarely consumed raw. So this is an exhaustive list of produce rarely consumed raw. So there is some disagreement, there's been a lot of conversation about there's some items on there on the list that maybe shouldn't be. There's other items that are on the list that shouldn't be, but this is the list right now of produce that's rarely consumed raw according to the FDA. And if you're growing, this specific produce, then you would be exempted from the rule. Also exempted is produce that's grown for personal or on-farm consumption, or produce that is not considered a raw agricultural commodity. So for example, produce that might go on to be further processed would be exempted. So if there's commercial processing where it's going to adequately reduce the pathogens, then that is exempted under the rule. But you do need to show documentation that you're getting and written assurances from whoever's buying the produce that it is undergoing commercial processing to adequately, reduce pathogens in the produce. And then farms with an average annual sales less than 25,000. So this is the value of the produce over the previous 3-year period, and it is adjusted yearly for inflation. So currently it's farms with average annual sales under $28,561 are exempted from the rule. Also, there are qualified exemptions. So these are businesses that have food sales. So keep in mind, this is food sales averaging less than 500,000 per year is adjusted for inflation. So currently, so over the last 3 years, so currently that's $571,000, $571,214. But additionally, they have to have direct sales to qualified end users that exceed sales to all buyers combined during the previous 3 years. So what this means, especially, I think part 1 is clear, but part 2 can be a little confusing. Basically, the qualified end user is the consumer of the food or a restaurant or retail establishment that is located in the same state or Indian reservation is the farm, or not more than 275 miles away. So they either need to be in the same state or not more than 275 miles away from the farm to be considered a qualified end user. And when they talk about the direct sales to these qualified end users have to exceed sales. So, for example, 51% of your sales have to go to a qualified end user to be exempted. Okay, so let's take a little break here and let's do a poll. So based on what we've just learned, what FSMA produce safety rule compliance category is the farm you're affiliated with fall under? Okay, we'll give it another few seconds for results. Okay, so it looks like 32% of people that responded are going to be exempt, and with another 12% qualified exempt. The 21% that are fully covered, if you have not taken the Produce Safety Alliance growers training, I highly recommend that somebody on your farm is taking that so that you know for sure what all the requirements are going to be under the rule. And then again, this just provides an overview of the rule for you so you can become familiar with it. And if you're not sure, please, feel free to reach out to us. And if you need help, and there's a lot of resources available to help further determine if you're covered or not. Okay, so modified requirements. Even if you're exempt, you need to prominently and conspicuously display the name, business and business address of your business, and it needs to be either on a label or at a point of purchase. So remember that. So even if you're exempted, you need to meet these requirements. You also need to perform an annual review and verification of your exemption eligibility, and you need to keep documentation of that. So things like receipts and invoices showing that, you're exempted, who your buyers are, that sort of information to prove your eligibility. You also need to review, sign, and date any records, and this should be performed by a supervisor or somebody that's qualified to show that you're meeting these requirements. So keep in mind, though, an exemption may be revoked if there is an active investigation of an outbreak for a foodborne illness, or if the FDA deems it necessary to protect the public health and or mitigate an outbreak. So do keep that in mind, even if you're exempted, that if there is an outbreak, and then the FDA could revoke the exemption. Okay, one thing I want to discuss real quickly is there's a lot of questions too about, produce safety rule. Are you also covered under preventive controls rule? And so this flow chart just helps give a little bit of an idea of whether you, even if you're covered under the produce safety rule, or maybe you're exempted or have an exemption from produce safety, are you going to be potentially covered also under preventive controls rule? So for example, the first question is, do you manufacture, process, pack, and or hold any kind of food for human consumption? So if, yes, then it asks, are you a retail establishment? So, this can kind of get a little confusing. So some places might have farms, but then they might also be selling the food. But remember, that would be, you're selling it to a qualified end user on the farm, right? So then you're not likely to be covered by the preventive controls rule. But depending on the amount of sales, you might still be covered under the produce safety rule. And so here, it asks, if you're a farm, are you only going to pack and hold food for human consumption on your farm? yes or no. If you're processing food, just to keep this in mind, you're allowed to dry, dehydrate, label, package, whole and processed produce. And you can also treat the produce to manipulate ripening. But if you're doing any other kind of processing, like mixing together different, cutting and mixing different greens, or, potentially, I keep thinking about cutting produce is a big one, and packaging it, but basically doing any kind of processing aside from drying, dehydrating, label, and packaging, or treating it to prevent ripening, then that's going to be considered processing. And you will likely need to comply with the preventive controls rule, or you at least need to check to see, what requirements you're going to have to meet under preventive controls rule for human food. So please make sure you keep that in mind. So, yeah, an example is if you're not doing any processing of food, or you're just dehydrating food and then you're selling it, the dehydrated food, then and it's not processed in any other way, then you would not have to comply with preventive controls. But if you start mixing the produce, if doing additional cutting on it, or doing any other type of processing on it, making value added food products, anything like that, you would be covered under the preventive controls rule potentially. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about some topics covered under the produce safety rule and some best practices. So we're going to focus on, here's the ones that are covered under the produce safety rule. So we're going to focus today on worker health, hygiene, and training, soil amendments, wildlife, domestic animals, and land use. So those are going to be the three that we're going to focus on today. And you can join us for part 2 for agricultural, water, post-harvest handling, and food safety plans next Tuesday. So moving on with soil amendments. So there's different types of chemical, or different types of soil amendments, as you're aware. So this can be chemical, biological, or physical materials that are added to support, the growth of the plant. And, it can also improve just soil fertility. It can, reduce runoff, those sorts of things. So biological soil amendments can pose microbial risk. And so these can include things like manure, or biological components that are from animal origin. So like fish meal, bone meals, those sorts of things. So even though they can potentially pose microbial risk, that doesn't mean that you can't use them, of course. They're great to use, especially like manures. They're extremely inexpensive. They're, easy to obtain and provide a lot of soil, health and plants health. But it's really important, though, to understand that they can pose biological risk. And so we want to just make sure that those risks are mitigated when you're using biological soil amendments. And so that's focused on under this rule. So treated soil amendments are considered soil amendments that have been processed to completion to reduce organisms of concern. So basically meeting microbiological criteria. And there's a lot of different processes. So for soil amendments, a biological that contain biological materials, like manure, or, fish meal, bone meal, those sorts of things. It's a good idea to have them processed to reduce pathogens in the soil amendments. So specifically under the rule, they say that treated soil amendments are those that have been processed to completion to reduce microorganisms of concern, so pathogens. So there's a lot of different valid controlled processes that you can use, and a lot of different validated processes. You can combine processes, to make sure that there's been a reduction in microorganisms that are harmful, or that it meets the microbiological criteria. And we'll talk more about these in just a moment. So soil amendments are considered untreated if they have not been processed to completion. And again, we'll talk about what that means in the coming slides. But this also includes such things as agricultural teas, where the biological materials have been unprocessed or, are considered untreated. If water is from an untreated surface water, so the water used to make the agricultural teas from untreated surface water, or if the water has detectable E. coli per 100 milliliter sample. So keep that in mind. So under the produce safety rule, to compost, if you compost or treat these soil amendments that are of biological origin, the rule does give a couple of requirements, and you guys might notice that they're very closely related to the organic requirements, right? So you can do an aerated static composting. So it has to reach a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days. And then with curing with management throughout all the materials to make sure the materials have reached that temperature and that and thus reduced potential pathogens in the material. And then there's turned composting, so that's also a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 days with a minimum of 5 turnings followed by curing. So these are ones listed under the rule, but you can also use other scientifically controlled processes. So as long as these processes are validated and shown to meet the microbiological standards for the compost, then you could consider it treated, that it's treated compost. So composting records, so under the rule, there isn't a requirement that you have to use composted biological soil amendments, but if you do, there are records that are required to prove that that they've met the microbiological criteria, right? So on the farm, if you're doing composting on the farm, you need to keep records showing how long the material was composted, the temperature that the material reached, so the temperature recordings that you take, the turnings of the compost, and then any other processing steps, you have to keep records for those. If you buy treated soil amendments from a third party, you need to keep the name and address of the supplier, and then the type of composted, of soil amendments you bought that have been composted, the date and the amount that was purchased, and then documentation of the composting and the treatment from the supplier. So you need to make sure that if you're covered under the rule that you keep these records, so those are required. So some application considerations. So we know that, raw manure is of higher risk, right? Because it comes from animals, and these untreated soil amendments at animal origin, because they're more likely to contain pathogens, okay? But there's some different requirements under the rule for both treated and untreated, because you can use either one. The one thing to note is that it's not recommended to use manure for fresh produce, because it can come in contact with the edible portion of the crop, and it's not a good idea to side dress, especially when the edible portion of the crop is present, because it can potentially contaminate the crop. It's also a good idea to maximize time between the application of the amendment and the time that the crop is harvested. So I know that there's different requirements under the organic rules, but Under the produce safety rule, if you are applying untreated soil amendments, the FDA does not have a standard between the time you can apply it and the time that you can harvest the crop. So they're still pursuing research on that. There may be changes to the regulation in the future, but right now, there isn't. Raw manure, though, cannot be applied to the harvestable portion of the crop. So that's, what the rule is. So keep in mind, as an organic grower, you should follow the organic program raw manure application requirements to make sure that you're still in compliance with organic rules. So these rules are not meant to override organic requirements. And in this case, I know organic regulations are stronger than the produce safety rule, but so make sure that you follow the application requirements for the organic program. Under the produce safety rule, treated soil amendments have a 0-day application interval, so you could potentially apply them on the same day that you harvest. But you do have to use a scientifically validated treatment process, such as we discussed in the previous slides. Okay, soil amendment application records. So it's a good idea to keep records of the type and source of soil amendments that you're applying and when they're being applied. And then also any handling and sanitation practices, because this is, this can help you if you have any issues, later on with, potential contamination of the produce, or if there's just any problems with that, it can help you with doing monitoring and putting corrective actions into place. And then it's also important to make sure that you're handling the soil amendments safely, right? So that you're not cross-contaminating your tools. So it's a good idea to have handling and sanitation practices in place, so standard operating procedures written out on how to handle soil amendments so that your workers can follow those. And then also on your practices on the farm for how to deal with those, and making sure that tools are, clean and sanitized in between use, so you're not getting cross-contamination of the produce between the tools and contact with the soil amendments, and then in contact with the produce. So you want to avoid that. Okay, so again, you want to designate tools and equipment for handling soil amendments, because they can be a source of pathogens. So it's just a good idea to have designated tools and equipment for dealing with soil amendments. You want to make sure that you clean and sanitize your equipment regularly and have protocols in place for how that's going to be done, and for, how the tools and equipment are going to be handled. Another thing to note is that foot traffic is a really big risk for contamination of produce. So if you have somebody out working with soil amendments, especially if they're untreated, and then they go and walk into a field, then they could potentially contaminate the produce, from their clothing, hands, shoes, those sorts of things. So it's a really good idea to put your soil amendments in a place where there's not going to be a lot of foot traffic through there, that they're a little more isolated. Another thing to note is it's important to try to minimize runoff and wind drift, because, if you get heavy rain onto an untreated compost pile, for example, then this can run off into the field and cause inadvertent contamination of the produce, or even of your agricultural water sources. Or if on a windy day, it could blow the soil amendments into the field, and then they might now be in contact with the edible portion of the crop and cause contamination of the crop. Under the rule, you do need to keep raw and finished compost in separate areas, so they definitely need to be kept separated. And you need to keep animals away from the compost, as much as possible. So it's a good idea to keep the compost covered, and because animals that are going to be going into the compost piles can then potentially spread contamination into the field. And then you also want to consider the risk to adjacent crops, because if you're out spreading, compost or soil amendments on one part of the, on one crop, and it's a windy day or it's going to start raining heavily soon, then that could potentially spread pathogens onto crops that are closer to being harvested. So really pay attention to any risk to adjacent crops when you're applying soil amendments. Okay, so even if you're exempt, some of the steps you can take now is to preferably use only treated amendments that have undergone a scientifically valid process, such as composting. So, you can use untreated soil amendments, but treated soil amendments are going to be safer. They're going to reduce the risk of contamination to the crop. And then you want to make sure that you have handling and storage procedures in place, and making sure that, you're cleaning and sanitizing your tools regularly. And then you need to keep records, especially if you're using treated soil amendments. Make sure that you have those records, either of the procedures you're using on the farm to treat the soil amendments, or from your supplier. So make sure you're meeting those requirements. And so by doing that, that'll help you start to become in compliance with the produce safety rule. If you're working towards, having, maybe getting additional buyers or having increased sales, this can really help with starting to work towards compliance with a regulation, even if you're exempted now. Okay, with that, I'll take some questions.
Great, thank you, Stephanie, for that overview. Yeah, we did have a couple questions come in. So someone was wondering, how are the exempted produce items that are rarely eaten raw decided? This grower grows quince and arona berries, and they're rarely eaten raw but are not on the list. They're just kind of wondering where those things came from.
Yeah, so that was done based on a survey. Erin, you might remember better the specific details, but it was based on a survey that was conducted on, produce that, was, whether it was consumed raw or not. And so that basically led to the list that the FDA created. And yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that. And you can, you can submit for an exemption and argue that with the FDA. So there is a process for doing that. If you're in disagreement, we know that, there's been, out here, there's a lot of, pea, lentils, those sorts of things. They're growing out in our area. And, I know some of those products are not on the list that we see out here. They're grown out here a lot, and they should be. I mean, they're dried. Nobody's going to eat that dry. Or I don't know, maybe they will, but not in the current form. It's not consumed. It's not really consumed raw like that, right? And then, we've seen that out here also with hops growers, for example, because they're not exempted. So there is a process for requesting reconsideration of the list.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So the survey that the FDA referenced, it's called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES. And I think historically it's a consumer survey, and it's been utilized to kind of look at nutritional issues, not necessarily food safety issues. So there was a lot of pushback in the beginning, like, the survey wasn't designed to figure out if people are applying a kill step to their produce. And so I think there have been a few successful additions. I feel like hops is maybe one. And I want to say grapes, specifically grapes to be used for wine production. There was some questioning, I think, in the beginning, like, is that fermentation a kill step? And I was actually involved we launched our own consumer survey to try and gauge how folks were preparing some more traditional Hispanic or Asian crops that are grown here in California. And, from my perspective, we had a lot of responses. We had about 6,000 people that responded to the survey. We collaborated with the National Sustainable Ag Coalition to write a petition letter to FDA, and actually had a few meetings with them, and have not heard anything back on whether any of those crops are going to be considered for addition to the list. So I will just say, if you're growing commodities not currently on that exempt list, it is a major challenge hurdle to try and get things added to that list. But you're certainly not alone in questioning why there are certain things on that list, others are not. And I think it's just kind of a limitation of the data that the FDA used to kind of generate that list to begin with. So good question.
And I'll add too, I think with some of those that aren't on the list, that where there have been challenges that they should be, I think last I read, FDA was doing enforcement discretion on it. So I'm not sure if there's still, I should check back and see if there have been any changes. I haven't heard of any, but last I knew it was they were doing enforcement discretion. So yeah.
All right. Thank you. I think, definitely complex with the number of different things people grow and how they get used. So thanks for kind of the insight on the backstory and that. So moving on, we also had someone that was wondering, do the sales of plant starts get included in the calculation of produce income for exempt status? So seedlings and that type of thing.
Yeah, so it's for produce sales and food sales. So I would argue that starts are not included because it's not food, right? So if you're selling starts and you're not selling the produce, then it's not food.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that logic. I'm going to do some searching too when Stephanie jumps back in. But yeah, I think you could have a very justifiable argument that those starts aren't included in that calculation.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to take one more question, then we're going to continue on with the presentation, but we'll loop back around with questions at the end. And there's a couple of questions here regarding sort of like dried products. So for sun-dried tomatoes, if you're slicing them in half, would they be covered under the requirements because they're sliced and not whole? And then there is also another question as to whether smoke-dried products like chipotle peppers, whether they're considered exempt. And so I think both of these are kind of getting at do they fall under the preventative controls rule versus the produce safety rule?
So what I would do is, reach out to your regulatory authority and just check check with them. Because there's going to be a lot of different things are going to fall under the compliance, right? So with the preventive controls rule, for example. So technically under the rule, if you start doing things like anything beyond dehydrating or or treating to reduce ripening, then that's going to start falling under processing. So I would argue that cutting, you're starting to get, that's considered processing. So we've had a lot of conversations about when produce is processed especially for other, issues and other regulations as well. And so, basically under the rule, anything besides what I specifically noted is potentially covered under preventive controls for human food.
Great, thanks. And I think too, what we've found in these webinars is there's a lot of little nuances, and every business is different. And so it's it can be helpful to watch these and then follow up with your extension professional or other people that can provide a little more guidance, get into the weeds on what you're doing and how you fall under the different rules.
Right.
And
all right, so I think we'll move on.
I was just going to say too, we got into a little bit of that in our first webinar too, like the types of processing that can fall under produce safety rule, which is very limited. But there's also what's called a farm mix type facility, which would exempt you from certain components of the preventive controls rules. So essentially it expands the type of processing that you can do without having to go through kind of the heavy lift of implementing preventive controls. You essentially would follow good manufacturing practices. You'd still have to register as a processor with FDA, but there's a little less scrutiny, I would say, on your production operation. So I'll refer people back to that first webinar, and I think there's some good resources in that presentation too that can kind of help you make that determination where you might fall.
Right. Thank you for adding that, Erin, because you can potentially be exempted from preventive controls too, but it's not to follow GMP. So yeah.
All right, so we'll move on, and then if you still have questions, write them in and we'll loop back around at the end of the presentation.
Great. Okay, so we're gonna start talking about worker health and hygiene right now and get into some of the requirements here and best practices. So we know that workers can potentially carry human pathogens, right, and transmit them onto produce. So some examples of ones that, workers can carry include viruses such as norovirus, hepatitis A, and then, bacteria such as Shigella and Salmonella typhi, but there's also potential for parasites and other, pathogens as well. So, because of this, it's really important that ill workers that are handling produce do not work or come in contact with produce, especially if they're having diarrhea or vomiting or jaundice. So it's really important that workers are not working when they're ill. Movement from the manure and compost and animal areas into the growing areas are potentially risky, and we talked about this a little bit already. So workers should really be aware of their movements, because this can potentially track pathogens into the field and onto the produce. Eating, drinking, and smoking in growing areas, basically you have that hand to mouth contact and then you're touching the plants. And so that's a way to contaminate the produce, as well as not appropriately washing one's hands, especially after eating, drinking, using the toilet, those sorts of things. So, the take home message is there's a lot of ways that workers can spread contamination into the field and onto your crops. So a few more examples are contaminating tools and equipment, and especially if the tools and equipment are going to be used in, one area of the farm and then brought into the field to be used for something else, where they're going to come in contact with the produce. And then, of course, not changing gloves, boots, or clothing regularly, including not having a way to change out clothes, and especially footwear and gloves in between, for example, handling soil amendments and then handling produce. Under the rule, gloves are not required to be worn, but if they are, they must be kept clean, or changed when they become visibly contaminated or torn in poor repair. They need to be changed out. It's also important to know that fecal contamination can, come in contact with the produce directly. So if a worker, for example, is defecating in the field, if they're not washing their hands after using the restroom facilities, all of these can contaminate produce. And then, of course, worker injuries, especially if they have wounds that might be infected or they've become injured on the farm and end up bleeding, especially if they're bleeding, they can contaminate the produce as well. So it's going to be really important just to be aware of all the different ways that workers can potentially inadvertently contaminate the produce. Under the produce safety rule requirement, you need to have toilet and hand washing facilities available for the workers and for visitors. And basically the rule does not state explicitly how many of those, but it does refer to OSHA requirements where there is one toilet and hand washing facility for every 20 workers within a quarter mile of the job site. So you need to keep in mind, though, that this may not be adequate. If you have a lot of workers in the field, and then the toilet and hand washing facility is a quarter mile away and they have to leave and walk to that facility and come back, then they may not be inclined to use it, right? So it's going to be really important to at least make sure that you have a facility available and that it's likely to be used by the workers. So you want to make sure that they're using those facilities. Also, under the rule, the facilities need to be designated, located, and maintained to be accessible for servicing, and they have to be serviced and cleaned at proper frequencies. They need to be kept clean. They need to be kept well stocked. So it's going to be, really important to be monitoring to make sure that those facilities are kept clean and kept stocked. The other thing to note is with hand washing facilities, I think a lot of times people's minds automatically go to, having functional sinks out in the field. And so this picture here just illustrates that there's a lot of ways you can have a hand washing facility, and this is perfectly adequate too. You have potable water. There is a catch basin to collect the dirty water. So that's one thing to note, is that you can't have hand washing water just running off into the field. It needs to be collected and then disposed of properly. And then as long as you have soap, paper towels, and then a garbage pail to collect paper towel waste, for example, then this would be an adequate hand washing facility. So with hand washing, so this is one thing where workers really should be trained on how to wash their hands properly and thoroughly. A lot of people, it's an easy thing to do, but it's one that isn't done properly quite often, So it's important to scrub your hands with soap and make sure you use running water, and then single service towels or hand dryers or other adequate methods should be used. So, it needs to be a single service towel, though, because otherwise you can spread contamination, and recontaminate the hands that have just been washed. Under the rule, the hands must be washed before starting work, before putting on gloves, after using the toilet, returning from breaks or other absences, after touching animals or waste, and anytime hands have been become contaminated. The other important thing to know is that hand sanitizer is not a replacement for proper hand washing. So you can use hand sanitizers in addition to hand washing, but they cannot be used as a replacement for hand washing. Okay, so workers need to take measures to prevent contamination of produce, which is going to include not working when they're sick and notifying a supervisor when they're ill. So this is, you know, a requirement under the regulations that workers need to notify, you know, supervisors if they're ill and not come in contact with the produce. So with regard to worker training, under the regulation, all of the workers need to be trained in the principles of food hygiene and safety and the importance of health and hygiene. So with this is going to also include visitors, and that visitors need to know that they are not to visit the farm if they're sick. They should know, you know, what areas of the farms they can and cannot visit. And, you know, they need to be made aware of your food safety practices. So that's a requirement under the regulation. Also, under the regulation, of course, workers need to be trained for their job responsibilities, right? So, so these are the training that personnel must receive under the regulations. So more of the training requirements under the rules include when training takes place, then this needs to be documented. So you should have the name of the trainee, the date that the training occurred, and the topic that was covered. And the training must be done by a qualified person. So somebody qualified to actually deliver that training and to be knowledgeable, you know, about the topic that the workers are being trained on. Training must occur upon hiring and at least once per year. And of course, you know, obviously if there are issues and people, you know, workers aren't complying, sorry about that, workers are not complying with, you know, regulations or farm policies, then training might need to occur more often. But according to the regulation, it's at least upon hiring and once per year. The training must be easily understood by the trainee. So you need to deliver it in a way that the person being trained is going to understand the information being delivered. So, you know, delivering training in written English may not be, you know, the best practice. It is not an acceptable practice if the workers only understand and speak, you know, read and speak Spanish, for example, or, you know, so you need to make sure that they can actually receive the information that's being delivered to them. So again, training needs to be repeated as necessary if standards are not being met. And it's good to have a designated person with your workers that are going to ensure compliance with the rule requirements and also verify, you know, training records. So again, you know, the workers and supervisors need to be qualified for the job that they're doing, and then also in food safety and hygiene practices. And so there should be at least one person on each farm that has taken, if the farm is covered, that's taken the Produce Safety Alliance growers training and is, you know, qualified under the regulation to be able to ensure the food safety practices are being followed on the farm. So, but both workers and supervisors need to be qualified for their duties through education, training, and experience through their job duties. So even if you're an exempt farm, you want to obtain, it's a good idea to obtain additional food safety training, and then also to identify any potential risk on the farm, and then make sure that your workers are going to be trained in food safety. Worker training records should be kept, so this is a good idea to do this regardless. And, just making sure that you're documenting training, that workers are receiving training regularly, and that they understand not to come to work if they are sick, not to handle produce, if they're ill, who to report injuries to, when to wash their hands, all those sorts of things are going to be really important. I always tell people your workers are your first line of defense. So if your workers are well trained on food safety, on hygiene practices, on risk of contaminating the produce and what that can mean when a consumer eats contaminated produce, if they're well trained on that and all your policies, then they can also be your first line of defense to make sure that the produce is kept safe, right, during your operations. And then the other thing that's going to be important is make sure you have procedures in place to reduce contamination risks, so standard operating procedures, doing monitoring, for example, of restroom facilities to make sure that they have paper towels, plenty of water, soap, that garbage is taken out, making sure that you have that people know not to walk through untreated manure piles and into the field, and how to apply your soil amendments or other things like that, making sure that procedures are in place so that is going to really help with reducing those risks. And then also making sure that you have adequate toileting and hand washing facilities, and keeping in mind that even though there are, the rule defers to the OSHA requirements, that it might be best to actually have more facilities available if possible, depending on what your farm and operations look like. And you want to keep them stocked and make sure you're doing monitoring to make sure that they're stocked, because people can't adequately wash their hands if there isn't any soap or running water available or paper towels, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to wildlife and domestic animals and talk a little more about land use as well. This chapter, we're going to focus on both wildlife, farm animals, and pets. And we know that all these animals can potentially carry human pathogens. And so we're potentially tracking pathogens on the produce surfaces, right? They can defecate in the growing areas. They can track feces through the growing areas. So because of this, it's a potential risk if animals are entering into the growing areas. We also are aware, and FDA is aware, that animals can be difficult to control. They can be there, year round, or you can have transient animals, out here. We can see, for instance, there might be herds of elk out in, a growing area potentially, right? And then they might be there in the spring when, depending on the type of field, maybe there's, some crops are starting to grow already. But, they might move on before it's even close to harvest, or they could, be walking through the field year round. So it is, the rule does make it clear, or under the FDA and the regulatory agencies, what I'm trying to say is they do understand that it's difficult to control animals. So we'll talk a little more about this as we go through these slides. So under the produce safety rule, the requirements are that you have to assess the relevant areas, the covered areas, for evidence of potential contamination during the growing season. If there are signs of potential contamination, you have to determine if the produce can be harvested, and you cannot harvest produce that is likely contaminated or visibly contaminated. So that's what the rule is going to that's what the rule states. So we'll talk a little more about how you can meet these requirements, some things to consider. So for monitoring and controlling wildlife, you want to be able to monitor for intrusion of animals. So things like, tracks, produce that has been trampled on, signs of nibbling, and of course, fecal contamination is a big one. if there is fecal contamination in the field, remember that you cannot harvest visibly contaminated produce. What you need to do then is determine if other produce has been contaminated or can be harvested. And then you're going to need to mark off no harvest zones and make sure that the workers know that they cannot harvest in that area. So basically, what the rule leaves open is, what is your no harvest zone? You need to make that determination. Is first of all, if the produce is contaminated, and if so, what's going to be your no harvest zone? Because if there's a very small, if you find a little bit of fecal content in the field, the harvestable portion of the crop isn't present, you remove the contamination, then the produce is likely to not be contaminated. It's probably okay to harvest the edible portion of the crop when it is present, right? Since when it's time for harvest, because it wasn't in contact with the crop isn't contaminated. On the other hand, you might have an area where there's a lot of fecal contamination, there's been a lot of activity, and you might end up having a really large zone where there's no way for you to be confident as to whether the produce is contaminated or not, and you're going to have to mark that off and not harvest it. But the rule basically leaves, this is subjective, right? As long as you're not harvesting visibly contaminated produce, and making a determination that can be backed up. Now, given this, it is expected that there will be co-management, that you are going to have wildlife coming into, your growing areas, that, you can't just, go out and harvest animals, for example, because they're in your growing area. So it is expected to be able to, coexist with the animals. And so it's recommended to use deterrents to help keep animals out. I mean, there's a lot of different issues depending on your setup, but, decoys can potentially be effective at keeping other animals out of the growing areas. Although I always joke, there's a city beach up north in Idaho, and even though it's not a growing area, there's an issue with a lot of geese, and then potentially contamination of the water that people are swimming in. And so they've put decoys out there, and it's funny because the geese just ignore the decoys now. So they'll be hanging out right in front of a decoy of a coyote. So, this might need to be changed up. So you're going to have to use whatever's going to work for your farm. Fencing is an option, using visual deterrents, noise makers, those sorts of things. Those can really help with trying to keep animals out of your growing area. But, again, keep in mind that you have to follow other laws. Nothing in the produce safety rule overrides other laws that may exist. So like I said, you can't just go out and shoot all the animals either. So documenting is going to help let you know if you're having increased problems with animal intrusion. So it's a good idea. Well, you need to do regular monitoring of the fields, but if you're documenting what risks were found, where it was found, where there's signs of intrusion, is this recurring? It'll help you determine if this is a recurring problem, that maybe you need to take different methods to try to keep animals out of your growing area. So doing that monitoring is going to be really helpful when knowing if you're having a persistent problem. And then also, documenting whether the risks were addressed and how the risks were addressed. So farm animals and pets, I know that this is often a hot topic, but they should be excluded from the field near harvest, especially when the edible portion of the crop is present. It is best to always exclude pets. I know that there's a lot of farm animals, and that farm animals can also, or Domestic animals like dogs, for example, can help keep other animals and pests out of the growing areas, but they can also cause contamination of the produce. So it's going to be really important to try to keep animals out of the field near harvest. And then also, if you have visitors coming to the farm, they should be told to leave their pets at home, because really you're trying to protect the produce from becoming contaminated. Farm animals should be kept separated from growing areas, and so you don't want to be walking through where farm your livestock and other farm animals are, and then going into growing areas, because this can, of course, track fecal contamination into the field and contaminate the produce. And then also you can get runoff from animal areas, or, during rain events from animal areas, or get wind drift from animal areas into the fields. So it's really important to pay attention to, placements. If you have a multi-use farm, and to try to prevent contamination of the crop, especially if you have animals on the farm animals. So keep that in mind, with your practices to keep the produce from becoming contaminated. It's also important to have procedures in place for handling fecal contamination. So having dedicated tools that are used for just that. Making sure that you're cleaning and sanitizing tools after they've been in contact. Footwear and gloves, if they become contaminated, they need to be changed out, so that you're not tracking that into the growing areas, that you're not handling, the produce with dirty gloves, for example. If produce has been contaminated, it should be marked off, and workers should know not to harvest it. And they should also know what to do if fecal contamination has been found. So it's going to be important to that they're trained on what to do if they do find fecal contamination. So again, the workers are going to really be able to help you with management. So make sure that they're adequately trained, and that they know not to harvest visibly contaminated produce, that they can keep an eye out for any problems and know who to report those problems to. Either that, well, I'd say or know how to actually handle the issue and have training on how to handle it, and also report it. Make sure that they're following proper hand washing, especially if they have been in contact with animals, with soil amendments, untreated soil amendments, fecal contamination, those sorts of things. And then also clothes, footwear, and gloves should be free from contamination. They need to be kept free from contamination. So it's going to be really important to dedicate footwear and gloves that can help with making sure that you're not inadvertently causing contamination. So if you have footwear and gloves for animal areas or for soil amendment areas, they're dedicated for those areas, and then different footwear and gloves and, potentially clothing that's used just in the growing areas, then that's going to be ideal, so that you're not causing contamination of the produce. And then your workers need to be aware that they need to clean their clothes, footwear, and gloves anytime that they've become contaminated, and should be aware of when they need to change these items out. So steps to take now for exempt farms. So it's best to exclude working animals when it's close to harvest. And you should be excluding non-working domesticated animals as a best practice. You want to make sure that you're doing monitoring, and also document if there are signs of animal intrusion, so that you can take steps to prevent animal intrusion into the growing areas. And then also, reduce the risk of contamination, reduce the risk that there's going to be less produce to harvest because of contamination. Deterrence can be extremely helpful. So that might be something to think about, depending on the type of animal that you're having problems with. Deterrence can help keep animals out of the growing area. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that produce that's been contaminated is not harvested. And you want to make sure that you have procedures in place and that your workers are well trained on how to identify issues and take steps to address them. So for summary for exempt farms, you want to, just start taking some steps towards complying with the rule and to improve produce safety. So, taking steps now are going to help with reducing cost potentially. So you put in a lot of expense to growing this produce and now you can't harvest it because it's contaminated. So that there's a big cost to that, right? So having this in place can help with reducing those costs. It can also make sure that, you're maintaining high quality and safety of the produce. And some of the buyers might actually, require this, require that you're in compliance with the produce safety regulations. So if you want to, try to grow your business, if you're in compliance with the produce safety regulations, then that can really help with increasing the number of buyers that are willing to buy your produce because they know you're in compliance with the regulations, even if you don't have to be. And overall, this is really going to help with, managing your farm and ensuring, the safest produce. And then, of course, there's a lot of regulations for the organic programs that you guys are already going to be following. So, a lot of this ties very closely, to that. I'm aware, or sometimes, the organic standards might be higher, but also, be familiar with good agricultural practices because those practices are going to really help with ensuring a safe product. And then at the end of the day, don't be afraid to reach out for assistance. And the goal of the regulators has been to do a lot of education. They don't want to be penalizing farms, but they are going to be doing inspections, but they really are trying to drive the education component of this. And so don't be afraid to reach out to your regulatory agency or, to extension or, CCOF, for example, to help with this. So here's some additional resources for exempt farms. I know we're running long on time, so I apologize for that, but these slides will be sent out to you, but here's a lot of additional resources. You can see there's all sorts of assistance out there for you, so don't be afraid to reach out. And then here's a few more resources, and these slides will be, you'll have these, with the slides being sent out to you after this webinar. So with that, let me see, Megan, did you want to do the poll first since I'm running a little behind, and then?
Yeah, why don't we do that? We'll run the poll and then we can hop into questions. And
Okay.
yeah, just say also, we will be sending out the recording. So if you need to hop off right at 11:30, feel free to do so, but you'll still have the information that we have available. You can watch the recording later. So just before you log off, we were curious to know what other types of trainings you would like to see. This is, as I mentioned before, a part of a series we're doing on food safety, predominantly for processors, but we also work with a lot of growers, a lot of our organizations. So we'd like to find out just like what trainings you're interested in so that we can take that into consideration as we move forward. So just give folks a little time to answer that. And then while people are doing that, I'll also put a link in the chat. Someone was asking if they wanted to petition FDA, like how they can do that to get their crops maybe added to the list of foods rarely consumed raw. And so the best way to do that right now would probably be to submit a question to the FDA Technical Assistance Network, and you can see the link there in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. and we can see there's a lot of interest in the produce safety grower training and also good agricultural practices, as well as some more handler processor related trainings like the preventative controls, qualified individual training, and some basic good manufacturing practices. So thank you for sharing that. And again, we will take that into consideration as we develop our future programming. And these webinars actually came from information from that poll. So we do take it into account. So to kind of jump into some questions, I know I wanted to kind of draw in Jacob and Heidi, who have been online with us, and just kind of ask, you work with growers that are looking to comply with both food safety and organic. And do you have any recommendations for folks on doing both? I think, as Stephanie mentioned, that it's a lot, particularly for a beginning grower. So just any recommendations on kind of how to do that and not get totally overwhelmed?
I can throw my 2 cents in on that. I think really also being an organic grower myself, we do mostly berries and some sweet corn and a few row crops. And what I really try and do is consolidate my record keeping so that I'm not filling out 27 different forms at the end of every day. Also just making sure that the forms that I have for people to fill out and keep logs are as simple as possible and as accessible as possible. Because if I'm not doing it all myself, then it can be challenging to find where that record is kept, and just making sure it's really consistent and it's really simple to fill out. And a lot of the requirements do overlap, and so they can be used for both. So I recommend making sure that the records work for your operation and that can work for food safety and organic at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Jacob, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I think Heidi really covered it because compliance with these rules, whether they're food safety or whether they're organic, are heavily based on how good your records can be. And so there's a lot of templates out there. CCOF has some templates on our food safety website for food safety templates. But I think, what Heidi mentioned about having good records and being able to demonstrate those to either your certification body or regulators, and just to track them, your own activities yourself on the farm and in the facilities is going to be really important. And then also to really kind of understand that, yeah, there are some areas where food safety and organic rules conflict, but by and large, I think there's more overlap. We work with a lot of people who get certified to food safety and organic standards at the same inspection, and a lot of it overlaps. So, don't be afraid.
Great, thank you. And I think too, we've been talking a lot about FSMA, which is obviously a federal regulation, but there are also, third-party auditors or audits for food safety required by buyers and other entities that you may also be involved with as well, depending on who you're selling to and who your buyers are. And again, I think that chart I mentioned at the beginning, that's also in the resources by the Community Alliance of Family Farmers, that kind of looks at the FSMA produce safety rule, the National Organic Program standards, and they also include third-party audit and what are required, and kind of compare all three. It's there if you want to get into the weeds about it. So kind of going back to some other questions that came in, someone was wondering, are there guidelines specifically how to deal with wildlife to prevent inhumane practices or freely hunting them and trying to get, manage the problem?
Yeah, you cannot freely hunt them. So, I mean, you have to be in compliance with other regulations as well. So, I mean, the rule really, basically you want to co-manage animals, right? With wildlife, you want to co-manage with wildlife. So the rule is that you can't harvest visibly contaminated produce, right? And so that's really what the rule is for wildlife, and that you do need to be aware of signs of, animal intrusion. You need to be checking your farm throughout the growing season, right? For signs of animal intrusion. If animal intrusion is found, then you need to decide what to do about it. So there's nowhere in there where you need to necessarily do anything about the animals. I mean, they do expect you to co-manage, and the more fecal contamination there is, the less produce you have to harvest, right? So that's where, using deterrence is going to be helpful. So you still need to follow, other regulations with like fish and wildlife, or fish and game, your regulatory agency for wildlife, right?
Great, thanks. And Aaron just recommended a link too that we put in the chat. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, just kind of, that is sort of one of the hot button issues, is the wildlife food safety interactions. And to be an organic producer, you need to maintain or improve the natural resources of your operation, including woodlands, wetlands, wildlife, air, and water. So there is that tension of protecting wildlife on your farm, and then also excluding it from the crop zone. So I've seen a lot of people have success with monitoring. So really just taking good notes on what tracks you're seeing out there on the either in your fields or on the margins, or if you have a hedgerow on the south border, maybe that's an area where you inspect more, or you implement some fencing. I mean, we do allow fencing in organic certification, but the fencing, must be used, implemented in a way that does not kind of restrict their flow to water sources. And so I've just seen people with a lot of success doing the monitoring, but especially pre-harvest. So making sure, a month before your harvest, you're really getting in your fields and understanding what the wildlife pressures are, trying to mitigate those through deterrence. And then especially, just before harvest, getting out there and making sure that you're doing a quality inspection, and that your workers are trained to really identify, bird droppings on whether it's a stone fruit that you're picking from a tree and discarding that in the field, or whether you're identifying coyote scat in your row crops. So I think really, and then documenting that you're doing that, I think is what I'm seeing out there, what I'm seeing people do with some success. So.
And Megan, I was just going to suggest that Wild Farm Alliance resource, but it looks like you just put it in the chat.
Yes, yeah. We just put 2 resources in the chat on co-managing food safety and conservation or sustainability. One's from UC Davis, and then the other one from Wild Farm Alliance. And both are really good resources for kind of, ideas on how to do that. So one final question that's a little more pinpointed, and then we'll wrap things up. Someone was wondering how they should deal with bird droppings in tree fruit. Do you need to exclude the whole tree, or can you section off other parts of the tree? What would be some recommendations for that?
So again, with that, I mean, you can't harvest the produce that is visibly contaminated. So, and the rule leaves it's subjective, right? As to how you're going to handle that. It's very subjective. So, as long as you're not harvesting visibly contaminated produce, and you could still harvest other produce from that tree, for example. And you're going to have to make a determination based on how widespread the problem is. If there is, you know, if the tree is mostly covered in fecal contamination, then you might skip it. You know, if it appears just some, you know, some of the fruit is affected, then you might, you know, still go in and harvest it. One of the things to take into consideration, though, is that, you know, with workers harvesting tree fruit, that they might grab the fruit and then their gloves become contaminated as well. So pay attention to that, that there's a possible risk of, you know, if they're wearing gloves or even, you know, their bare hands, that they might become contaminated, and that can be passed on to other fruit on the tree during harvesting. So really it is going to depend on the amount of fecal contamination there is, what you're going to do about it, and how you're going to handle that. So if there's a lot, maybe not. If it's, you know, one area, you can block off and say, don't harvest this side of the tree. If it's you know, few pieces of fruit, then you can probably harvest the entire tree and just make sure that, you know, those particular pieces are not harvested. So there's a lot of options.
All right, thank you. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you all for being here today and staying online a little late. We'll just kind of go quickly through these wrap-up slides. As we noted before, this is part of a series, and we have a number of additional webinars coming up in the spring. So check those out on the CCOF website. And then the past recordings of these webinars, if we go to the next slide, are on the CCOF YouTube channel. So you can always go there to watch past webinars. The first webinar in the series that Erin was talking about on the preventative controls rule and kind of all the different compliance categories for that is on the website, and we'll also send a link out to that in the follow-up resources. And then I think that's it. So thank you for joining us. And when you log out of the webinar, there will be an evaluation form. We'd love to hear your thoughts and get a few more ideas for future programming. And thank you again to all of our speakers. I know you all have very busy and have lots going on, so we appreciate you taking some time to chat with us about produce safety. All right, so have a good rest of your day.